Okay, and then I'm going to spotlight myself. And I think we're ready to go. Does everybody see me more or less full screen?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So now I'm going to mute everybody, mute all, and then I'm going to unmute the co-hosts. Let's see. Okay, now I see. Okay. All right. Welcome to our fourth meeting. And this one, I urge you not to be discouraged if you found this hard going, because it is difficult, but be encouraged by the fact that this is by far the most difficult piece that we will be doing for the next half year with this series here. And in fact, it's actually, in some ways, it's even more difficult than Society of the Spectacle, because Debord, even when he gets into some pretty difficult things, he's more precise and he's more, how to say, like Vaneigem in this, I think you can tell at times, is, it's kind of self-indulgent what he's doing here. And that's part of the power of the thing, for sure. But sometimes, like when Debord puts a sentence in, it's there for a reason. It's not just because he kind of got carried away in a sweep of what he's saying and he's laying it on thick. Debord doesn't generally do that. So even things that are difficult, dialectical kind of things, you can pretty much trust that, Debord knows exactly why he put that there, because he deleted a whole lot of other stuff going in. Vaneigem, at this stage anyway, was just driving in like a madman, like a poet might do sometimes, like he's just possessed by this vision, and he will just churn around and come back to things and do all kinds of stuff. So it's not that there's no reason that it's there, but you can't count on, like, many times he'll make a thesis, he'll make a point, and then he'll develop that point over and over and over, not just a simple repetition, but he'll kind of, it will go into a turbulent sort of thing, like a prose poem or something like this, where you're not really sure. Okay, he'll say something about the master and the slave is doing this, and then he'll add something like said, which means that the consciousness of the being is like the being of consciousness, or something. Well, what is the connection there? So it probably does mean something in most cases, but he's not necessarily helping you out by just throwing all this stuff in there. So I would say, not that the whole thing is like that, but you will find some of the stuff in here is not really digested. It's just sort of put there. So that being the case, I'm going to start, well, first of all, I'll start with a few words about Vaneigem himself as a person and where he came from and all that. And then we will start with part one, but we'll start with that summary of part one that's at the beginning of part two. And that will be like the first half of our session here. Then we'll go to Q&A, and then we'll go to the second part and do Q&A. So Vaneigem was born in 1934, I believe, in Belgium, and which is French-speaking, as probably most of you know, although it has some other language there too. So kind of in the periphery of France, he spent a lot of time in Paris. And he, as a young man, he was a brilliant guy, and quite radical. And he was like really interested in Lautréamont and some of these other kind of pre-surrealist type of people. And I believe that he was in France, and he was a student of Henri Lefebvre's, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, he knew Henri Lefebvre around 1960-ish. And when he was there, he was talking about these different things, and Lefebvre says, "Oh, you ought to meet Guy Debord and Michel Bernstein. They're good friends of mine, and they're talking about the same kind of things that you're interested in. And here's a copy of their journal," and so on. So he was immediately struck, and he did meet them. And when he met them, I have a book here for those of you who read French. This is a book you'll want to get. It's a long series of interviews with Vaneigem much later, like, 5 or 10 years ago, when he's an old man. And the publisher of this company is interviewing him in detail. Well, what was Michelle Bernstein like? What was all this? And he said, "Oh, I was immediately in love with her the first time I saw her." So anyway, he was really struck by the Situationists, particularly Debord and Michel. And he joined the SI almost immediately, it seems. And he was one of the really driving forces in the early 60s. As you can see, Banalities, basic Banalities is just the most extreme example of how heavy duty he got into these things. And so when this article was first came out in the two parts, this was actually, even though it's the most difficult Situationist thing, this was almost the first thing to be translated into English, oddly enough. And it was translated, here's the original pamphlet, called The Totality for Kids, and which is, you can see he's already playing around with the same thing, like the British translators made up that term, but that was sort of their way of saying, "Oh yeah, like Vaneigem says, these are just basics. These are the ABCs." And of course, this is ridiculous. Come on, this is like, PhD level stuff. What are you talking about here? So this pamphlet came out very soon after the things were written, I think in 1965 or something like that, 65 or 66. And so this was one of the first 2 or 3 things that I read when we were learning about the Situationists. And he said, "Who are these?" And I found these on Telegraph Avenue. And I looked at them and I said, "Wow, these are," so obviously I didn't understand a lot of it, but there's enough there where you really say, "Ooh, this guy is heavy." And so anyway, I'm now going to go to the beginning of the second part, where he summarizes the first part, and I'm going to read most of that. It's a very good summary. The vast majority of people have always had to devote all their energy to survival, thereby denying themselves any chance to live. And those two, survival and live, are all caps here. And this is one of the big themes of Vaneigem: life as opposed to survival, or it's, that the SI, but I think Vaneigem really pushed this more than anybody, developed it and talked about it more. The notion that surviving is not the same thing as living. And yet, of course, you have to survive in order to live. So you're in this complicated situation. They continue, the majority of people, to do so today, as the welfare state imposes the elements of this survival in the form of technological conveniences, appliances, preserved food, prefabricated cities, Mozart broadcast for the masses, etc. The organization controlling the material equipment of our everyday life is such that what could potentially enable us to construct it richly plunges us instead into a poverty of abundance. Alienation becomes all the more intolerable as each convenience promises freedom and turns out to be only one more burden. We are enslaved by the means of liberation. And I'm skipping a little bit here. Private appropriation, and I hope that's self-explanatory. It means the process of someone or someone's taking something for their own self. It's like they're stealing, it was common, and then you say, no, this is mine, you can pay the rent, you can buy it from me, or whatever. That's all that means. Private appropriation entails an organization of appearances. So here we have the spectacle, but this could have been religion or various other things that serve the same idea, by which its radical contradictions can be dissimulated, hidden. The servants must see themselves as degraded reflections of the master, thus reinforcing, through the looking glass of an illusory freedom, everything that increases their submission and passivity, while the master must identify himself with the mythical and perfect servant of a god or of a transcendence which is nothing other than the sacred and abstract representation of the totality of people and things over which he wields power. A power all the more real and unquestioned as he is universally credited with the virtue of his renunciation. We'll get going over that in different ways. The mythical sacrifice of the boss corresponds to the real sacrifice of the underlings. Each negates himself in the other. The strange becomes familiar and the familiar strange. Each fulfills himself by being the inversion of the other. From this common alienation, a harmony is born, a negative harmony, whose fundamental unity lies in the notion of sacrifice. This objective and perverted harmony is sustained by myth, this term being used to designate the organization of appearances in unitary societies. That is, in societies where slave, tribal, or feudal power is officially consecrated by a divine authority, and where the sacred allows power to seize the totality. And note that in French, and the word power, pouvoir, can mean exactly what we mean by power, but it can also mean more specifically a government, a regime. Like if you talked about le pouvoir Gaulliste, it meant the de Gaulle regime. Or sometimes the pouvoir could just be like the rulers, the ruling class, the state. When you see power being played around, sometimes you have to bear in mind that sometimes it's not just abstract power. It means the people in power or the organization of power. Then I'm going to skip a little bit here. When the bourgeoisie seized the state, the unity of power was destroyed, this previous transcendent unity. Sacred private appropriation became secularized in capitalist mechanisms. Freed from the grip of power, the totality once again became concrete and immediate. The era of fragmentation has been nothing but a succession of attempts to recapture an inaccessible unity, to reconstitute some ersatz sacred behind which to shelter power. A revolutionary moment is when everything that reality presents finds its immediate representation. In other words, everything suddenly becomes clear, open. All the rest of the time, hierarchical power, increasingly deprived of its magical and mystical regalia, strives to make everyone forget that the totality, which has never been anything other than reality, is exposing its fraudulence. So that's the end of this summary. And we'll go back, and given that summary, I think that part one, the gist of part one is probably simpler than part two, in the sense that it mostly is just going over 2 or 3 key themes and kind of developing them. And so I'm going to read some passages from part one, but my main point is that here's some of what's going on is Vaneigem is going through the history of society. So he goes back to hunter-gatherers and this and the slave society and the bourgeoisie and so on. But what's going on then is different stages or phases of hierarchical society, because it's always been hierarchical. Even right in the early beginnings, it had an element of hierarchy, although it was a more organic hierarchy, where everybody was sort of in the same family or clan or something. So what he's doing is that there's always some masters and slaves, or masters and servants, or masters and workers at these different stages of society. But he's going through different ways in which that relationship is evolving and going into different kinds of variations. So a lot of part one is just sort of playing like a musician, is like playing a theme, variations on this theme. It's not just repeating it like leftist propaganda typically does. Oh, that's bad. It's really bad. And I'm going to tell you again, that's bad. And you don't want that. And because you don't like it, there's one choice, vote for this guy or whatever it is. It's not that kind of repetition. It's what Debord and the Situationists would call a dialectical sort of repetition. You're going through some of the same themes, but each one has a different angle. And that's what is done in Society of the Spectacle a lot, more consistently, actually, looking at one thing, but it sort of looks like he's saying the same thing over and over, but actually he's giving different nuances about it so that you get a big picture. So Vaneigem is giving us different nuances about the relation of the master and slave, and including obviously the material things, but even including the sort of psychological things, like what's going on in the master's mind. He has to, okay, I'm the boss, great, but who am I the boss over? Well, I'm the boss over these non-entities. Well, how can I take pride in being a boss over non-entities, or something? So it's complicated. And then the people at the bottom are taking pride in the fact that they're serving this glorious boss, this god, or whoever, and it could be that they're serving this glorious martyr. This is somebody who died for the revolution or was sacrificed for people like Prometheus or Jesus. And so you think, gosh, I'm just an old smuck. I'm doing these things for myself, but he did all this for us. Gosh, and we're blown out. Like it wouldn't occur to criticize such a person because they're so far beyond us in all the sacrifices they've made and all that. So Vaneigem is, I think that's to say, that's the gist of much of what is in part one. I'm just going to scroll through here. I did some notes, and I'm even going to not read all of them, but the early socialization of primitive human groups reveals a will to struggle more effectively against the mysterious and terrifying forces of nature. We talked about this a little the other time, like, should we use the word domination of nature and blah, blah, blah. Well, back at this period, it was pretty clear. Like, if you didn't dominate nature, you died. So you can nuance it and say, well, you're working with nature. Well, of course, you're using a club to beat away a saber-toothed tiger or something. But definitely you're fighting many elements of nature or you wouldn't survive. Even as, certainly not as a baby or something, so there was no question there. Anybody who thought differently didn't survive. And so all of us who have survived here are descendants of people who, yes, we did fight nature and we sort of, we managed. We're still here, but it wasn't easy. So he's saying it's a hard struggle, and it took thousands of years to figure out, what do you use fire for? How do you build stuff, weapons and things to hunt with and all this. But the point is that once you got to a point where you were somewhat successful in that process had already brought in new elements, like you no longer have to fight the saber-toothed tiger, but now maybe you have to fight against your neighbor who has a big club, and what, and it's, so you have to come up with something else there. And then when it gets to a little later stage where you've sort of come together with other humans to have things like agriculture or to hunt together or something, you end up having some kind of power structure, like there's some boss hunter and he ends up, through gradual development, owning everything, because he's sort of representing the whole, and as representative of the whole, I own all this. And you guys, if you're good, you can have part of this. So there's all these, kind of wicked nuances. It's sort of funny, and yet it's sad because that's how most of history has been. So then Vaneigem said, today, so he's jumping ahead thousands of years, same process is going on. The technocrats propose to put an end to primitive alienation. With a stirring humanitarianism, they exhort us to perfect the technical means that in themselves would supposedly enable us to conquer death, suffering, discomfort, and boredom. But to eliminate death would be less of a miracle than to eliminate suicide and the desire to die. There are ways of abolishing the death penalty that can make one miss it. Again, I'm going to kind of skip through. He goes in when they start, the hunter-gatherers shift more to hunters. And then when you have this and you're successful hunters and you have a little bit more population, then you may be able to sort of say, hey, this is where we live. and if another clan or another species comes in there, you want to fight them back because you're living on this, the game that you're hunting down would be hunted down by somebody else, etc. So then you end up getting in this sort of more war tribal mentality, which means there's a premium on developing better weapons, becoming more skilled warriors, etc., etc. And once again, this kind of thing feeds on itself so that, by the time you're developing more and more sense that this is our land. Here's the border. Don't step over this border or we'll kill you. And so once you get that, then the thing about owner and people who aren't owners, the division becomes more extreme. After a while, it's like king and aristocracy versus everybody else, with a sort of police or warriors being the layer between them that protects the top person. But as Vaneigem points out, even those people like the police or the thugs the bodyguards, because they're so close to the king or the aristocrats, they feel privileged and they kind of identify with that. So they'll even die for the person, he thinks so highly of me. He asked me to sacrifice my life for him. He wouldn't ask those people over there that. That's because he's proud of me, or blah, blah, blah. It's then this develops into valorizing that subservient position, so that one way or another, work, labor, subservience is seen, or it's promoted as something good. It's noble, the dignity of labor, all this kind of thing. And that persists even into modern times. We have the work ethic, or some of the Protestant ethic, all this kind of thing. And we also have, even in the modern pseudo-revolutions in the Stalinist countries, they do the same thing. They have practically a cult of the valiant worker. This guy worked, you slips are only working 60 hours a week, but this guy worked 80 hours a week. He's a hero, emulate him, do like that, and he didn't even ask for overtime pay, which of course he wouldn't have gotten anyway. So Vaneigem and the Situationists generally, looking at that, are saying that is complete bullshit, obviously. And this is one of the things that actually we'll come to a little bit in the part 2, so I won't go into it too much. But the idea that of not saying the noble worker or something like that, as if there was something inherently good about that. Let's see. Okay, there's this point here. I told some of you earlier, there's this guy in Austria who is not here because it's 2 a.m. there. And he emailed me about one of the articles we looked at last session. And he said, in the article, "The Bad Days Will End," the SI mentions several aspects of acts of violence. For example, the striking miners of Merlebach, attacking automobiles which were parked in front of a management building. However, these cars belonged to fellow employees. The article concludes, quote, "Who can fail to see in this action a gesture of self-defense against the central object of consumer alienation," unquote. And so he goes on, his name is Robert. "I would argue that most, if not all, strikers did not consciously understand this action as a gesture against the automobile as a symbol of consumerism and source of consumer alienation. The intellectuals of the SI could see it that way. We may see it that way. Is this discrepancy not a general problem within intellectual circles? Was the SI equally prone to it? And I answered, the article does not say that any of those workers, let alone all of them, consciously understood, all caps, this action as a, quote, gesture against the automobile, as symbol, blah, 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 unquote. It accurately says that it clearly was such a gesture. Who can fail to see is a hyperbolic way of saying that anyone with any intelligence or common sense will see that that was what was involved, even if the news reporters and pundits and commentators remained puzzled and clueless. Just as, for example, if straight men go around frantically beating up gay men, it can reasonably be said that such men are obviously reacting this way due to their hidden fear of their own homosexual tendencies, even if they obviously do not consciously understand this fact. The point is, so, but I said, but thanks for bringing up this issue. I will quote your query and my response at our next session. So I'm mentioning that in this part of part one, where he says, much can be expected of, and he says the new proletariat, which is discovering blah, 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 and the rebellious youth and so on. And the force of the SI, our ideas are in everyone's mind, etc. So again, what Vaneigem is getting at there is not what Robert said, SI intellectuals projecting their consciousness onto workers or other people. What they're doing is exactly the same thing that Marx was doing in 1843 when he said something to the effect that the workers or the proletariat may or may not know what's going on, but circumstances are going to compel them to find out whether they like it or not. So Marx and Engels were not telling workers what to think or what they should do even. They were saying, we are we're laying out how things are. And how things are has different consequences. They're going to lead to this or something like this. And we think that you will find this. If you haven't already figured it out, you are going to learn this. And so when they saw workers revolting in Lyon in 1841 or something like that, like a weaver's strike or whatever it was, there was some early thing like that. This was one of the things they did. They didn't say that the workers knew they were doing a communist thing or whatever they wanted to call it. They're just saying that's what they are doing. They may or may not realize that they're this cog in this machinery in this place, but that's what's going on. And if we understand that, we can better understand where we all stand in this and see it, rather than having our heads filled with philosophies and different ideas and ideologies and stuff like that obscures that. So that's all that they're doing here. So I think that I will stop there at this point and shift to Q&A, focusing primarily on what on part one, the things I've read and the other things that Vaneigem discusses in that first part. And then when we've done with this Q&A, we'll go to part two, which has a somewhat more varied bunch of tangents, and we'll get into that. But right now, I think we're focused on just a few things here. So if you have questions, I think you can raise your hand, digital hand, and I will then see you and call on you. You can also type questions in the chat. So let me see here. Okay, I'm still spotlighted, but I will. Okay, Mary, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi.
Oh, there you are. Okay,
Good.
good.
Okay, good. I don't have a question because I don't know anything really about the subject, but I just want to make a comment. You were reading from sometime in the 1960s an article, right?
Right.
Okay. So it was like when you were talking, the first thing I want to say that was really good was when you mentioned that there's always a hierarchy. Even in a hunter-gatherer band society, there's a hierarchy, and that's true. And it's just as if there's a hierarchy in the family dining room. There's just it. I guess it makes life more ordered. And the thing about a lot many things that you said is there's a study in anthropology. Part of the studies, there are many studies in anthropology. One of them is called evolution of state theory. And what this is there are discussions as to how does a band society, I mean, at one time we were all band society, we were all wandering around in groups of family units of 15 to 7, something like that.
Mary, before you go farther.
No, I just want to finish this.
Okay.
I just want to say evolution of state theory has really evolved from what you've stated. And I don't, the reason I mentioned evolution of state is that people are like, what does that mean? I just wanted to say that. And one of the things is the whole hunter-gatherer thing. Man the Mighty Hunter, that's really been in anthropology circles, that's been really disproven. And you start seeing it coming out in more what was public, not so academic articles. And I just want to say that a lot of what you were saying, yeah, it was right. It was the thought in the 1960s. It's not the thought now.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to answer here. That doesn't matter. It's kind of irrelevant because we're not talking here about what is the best history book or what this. These points are raised because they do matter. Not that it matters whether in 30,000 BC such and such a transition took place, something like that, but just that in general, there were various hierarchical types of things that developed in ways that aren't going to change from 50 years ago or something like that. It doesn't really matter if hunters came before gatherers or if there were more, or if agriculture was invented in 10,000 BC or 5,000 BC or all this. We're just looking at types of things where we can point out some sort of thing that's going on. And some of these things were going on regardless of whether modern anthropologists have said, oh, that's too early or this conflicts with this. It doesn't, the fact is that all previous societies with sort of, you can kind of fudge it if you go way back and you're just in, where it's practically just like a family of chimpanzees or something like that. Even that has its hierarchies, but we're not debating this. It's only like to understand a little bit where we're coming from. people would say, well, why was it different in the Middle Ages? Why was it different in ancient Greece? Or ancient Rome was different than ancient Greece? And, they blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is not relevant. You can look into it, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about changing our lives. And this, even if there's a different opinion about these things, that's not what we're talking about. That is what people talk about in universities and stuff in order to get a degree, that sort of thing. Yeah. This is like, what's his point here? And his point, which may be hyperbolic or something, is this has been history has been a nightmare, and we know somewhat about what it was. We may not know all the details. And we're not setting up, oh, this society was great or something. We're just looking for little bits. Like there may have been a few times where you can say, oh, there was a little glimmer of light there. From our perspective, we don't even care from their perspective. They're dead, but we can see something that said, that's something we could still use. And this is something that clarifies, like sometimes you can clarify some very modern thing in the middle of New York or something, with something that happened 50,000 years ago. There's still some elements of things that are going on with people. I want to move on. Ed Matthews.
One thing that I found really interesting in this, rereading it now, I think maybe the third time, is certain words will pop out to try to sort of encapsulate what he said up to a certain point and then return dialectically back to it. And the very beginning of section 9, where he talks about myth. And really, this is, again, a very Marxist way of looking at, to resolve something on a theoretical level. The unitary absolute in which the contradictions of the world find an illusory resolution. To me, that really is a sentence that encapsulates much of part 1. This myth that we've created around sacrifice, against devotion, subservience, because without it, the system would grind to a halt. People would go, hey, I'm saying no. So there's a return to this notion of myth as being so crucial to the continuation of the development of increased alienation, increased subservience. And then finally says, myth is a sphere of the sacred, the extrahuman zone where the abundance of revelations are manifested, but where the revelations of the process are carefully suppressed. So that which allows the myth to continue is never discussed mythically or metaphysically, but the myth is required for people to continue to do so. So one of many little, they're not contradictions, but these little dialectical turns, much like something Heraclitus would write. My students had a lot of difficulty with this, and one guy wrote a paper just on the mythic aspects. And when he found them and underlined them, the paper began to make a lot more sense. But it certainly is in keeping with what you're saying. Without this myth of subservience and sacrifice, history would no longer be able to continue.
Next spring, when we're reading Society of the Spectacle, we will come upon some other examples that Debord uses, again, going back to primitive societies and so on. And, like the cyclical time. And once again, it's really irrelevant to say, well, this society didn't really have, it wasn't 100% cyclical and blah, blah, blah. We understand the notion, which has come out of anthropology. And if you do understand that notion, then in Society of the Spectacle, Debord points out what he calls pseudo-cyclical time, which is where we are. And he says, what does that mean? Well, we understand what it means because we've read these books about, the Polynesian people or the, whoever, we're going through these things and we see that we're doing something analogous. So the point has nothing to do with saying, well, was, was this exactly accurate that such and such society was totally cyclical? Doesn't matter. It's enough that these are things that have been developed by science or by people exploring stuff or speculating on things, and we can use them. Kirsty. Can you unmute yourself? There you
Can you
Did.
unmute?
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I mean, this is kind of on that topic of, he's saying that the natural alienation somehow gave rise to social alienation. And not to go back to the same point again about, I also feel that the kind of early hunter-gatherers societies, that it is valid to say that they were really not hierarchical in the sense that he and people of his time thought they were. But I have a question about this passage on page 119. This is in section 4. That's kind of about that, sort of near the end of that section. It says, beyond the struggle against regimes whose vision of paradise is a cybernetic welfare state, lies the necessity of a still vaster struggle against a fundamental and initially natural state of things, in the development of which capitalism plays only an incidental, transitory role. Can you say something about what he means by that, this vaster struggle?
Okay, let's see.
So it's right at the bottom.
Right,
of
right. Yeah,
chapter 4
I
here.
see it there. Let me see.
I mean, is he talking about being able to kind of quote unquote dominate nature without being in a hierarchical structure of some kind?
Well, I think first of all, in the sentences just leading up to that, he's saying that where this is the thesis where he says that the hunter thing societies would tend to give engender the notion of a boundary, because your group has their hunting land and another group they don't want it to take over. Whereas if you're a gatherer society, you know, that becomes less significant. But so he's saying that from that boundary thing, which sort of leads more and more to owner things, he's going through control by class, group, caste, individual, over whose forms remain complex forms of domination, ranging from ownership of land, territories, factories, or capital. Any of those things will give you domination, and they're increasingly subtle. Like if you own capital, it's like, what? Oh, I have this piece of paper in the bank, you know, that says I have the equivalent of the hydrogen bomb or something. And going to the pure exercise of power over people hierarchy, that's just where, you know, there's just nothing but that dominance. But beyond the struggles of this still vaster struggle, in which capitalism is only incidental, transitory state of things. I think what that refers to is sort of what he's talking about when he talks about the cybernetic welfare state, this kind of thing. And I see that back when I first read this, I was a little unsure what he meant, you know, people with computers doing stuff or something like that. But I think was sort of a prescient thing, looking towards a society that we are increasingly in, with all the internet kind of things and digital kind of things and stuff like this, where the power becomes so abstract that even the people who have power almost don't get it. Yeah, you know, like you're just sort of it's sort of like a dystopian film or something like that, where everybody, you know, it's just this hell in which it's kind of like he says in another thesis, the torturers and the tortured are equal in it, and only the torture is real.
Yeah.
And again, it's kind of hyperbolic. Maybe you can say, well, what is he talking, you know, but I think the gist is he's talking about such a sick, sinister kind of development that it is kind of like being in hell, and yeah, some of the demons are dominating others, but it's escaped so far that it doesn't even have much to do with who owns things anymore, you know. And I can only assume that he's referring to something like that when he says capitalism itself is just a transitory thing. So he's like saying something that is sort of going beyond capitalism, even whatever that would be, but it's not liberating us. It's just it's yet another thing. And I'm thinking that kind of capitalism could be this sort of thing where I know nothing about these, but you know, like when people talk about the global economy and they say there's $1 trillion of, you know, something, but the debt of the globe is like 100 trillion, you know, and it's so unreal that anybody, even they think they're manipulating. It's just like it's a total nightmare. You know, you don't even know what the substance of it is. I'm just guessing that he's kind of hyperbolically suggesting this nightmare that he sees, that he sometimes calls more prosaically the cybernetic welfare state, where it's sort of more like a Brave New World combination with 1984 or something. That's a I don't
Okay.
know.
Yeah.
Mitchell.
Hey, two things. So about the anthropology. So I took a lot of what Vaneigem was doing with the anthropology, was just basically reiterating that kind of the Marxist Hegelian just analysis that, hey, humans are born into nature, they're part of nature, but they're also part of culture. And how do they overcome? I mean, nature, Heidegger says, like, you're out in the cold. What are you gonna do? You're gonna start a fire. That's human. That's culture. What do you do? You're gonna build a roof over yourself. That's culture. And so that's a pretty standard formulation in Hegel and Marx. And then what we're able to do, we're able to conquer nature, but now we have civilization. Oh no, an even bigger problem. Civilization, the subjectification we created, even bigger problem. That's point one. And two, on the cybernetics. So, I don't actually know what cybernetics is. Cybernetics is this field of theory.
Let's not get too complicated here.
Okay. No, I'm not going to. But cybernetics means control. It's a theory of control.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to do with computers.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's all. So I don't think you have to fantasize, Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. You just have to think about the current models of control, of society control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lee.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't get a chance to check back, but I wanted to compare. I seem to remember there's some significant discrepancies between, I believe it was Chris Gray's translation, the first translation into English, and that's published in Leaving the 20th Century, the first SI anthology, basically, and your translation. And I just wondered if you could comment. I mean,
I don't recall anything that was very significant, frankly. I mean, I think I did a better version, but to all of you, I think you can get too complicated here. We're not, I wouldn't be reading this stuff, and I wouldn't have bothered to translate it if all that it was enabled us to do is debate philosophical things and this kind of thing. Its point is to help us change the world. And the reason it can do that, regardless of whether he got this anthropological thing a little different, or whether, you know, is not really to the point. We can see that he's exaggerating, that he's sort of, he's almost like writing, it's not like poetry exactly, but he's writing up a storm here, and he's very into it. He hates the society he's in, you know, but there's a kind of lyricism of saying it's so exciting that we could destroy this whole thing. So we have to look for, what can I use here? And what you can use is irrelevant about, you know, well, this term means this, or some people think this term means that.
I wasn't even thinking about any of that stuff, Ken. I was
Okay.
just thinking there's some very lively stuff in Chris Gray that I wonder if he took poetic license, and maybe it wasn't entirely faithful to the letter, but maybe to the spirit.
Well, when I did these translations, I closely examined every previous one, especially when it was kind of a semi-official one like his. So if I changed it, I was aware of what he did, and I decided, oh, this would be more accurate this way. That's all.
Okay.
So I don't recall which changes that would be, but Danny?
I raised my hand, Ken, because there's a question in the chat that I wanted to bring
Okay.
up, because I thought it might be useful. Perhaps not everyone here is schooled in Marxism, or perhaps not as fresh as once they were. Keys to reading any of these texts is an understanding of the Marxist term alienation. Would you explain it? Bonus, explain synthesis.
Okay. I think there's two things I could say about alienation, is that when people, most people use the word alienation, they mean that they don't feel good. This is alienating. It puts me off, you know, it's something like this. And that's only one aspect of alienation. Alienation, in the sense that Marx used it, is the more literal original sense, which means that there's something alien, like you are, it could be that you're robbed of something. Something is alienated to me, you know, like the term, he alienated her affections, means that he seduced her away from you, you know. And if you alienate some property, it means that you manage to get it into your hands out of somebody else's hands. If you're working in a factory, the alienation is not just that you feel bad, but that literally your work is being stolen from you. It's being alienated from you. And as a result of that, you feel alienated. But those are kind of the two different terms, and both mean, but the primary means is theft. You know, it's like that something has been taken away from you.
Can I say something
Yeah,
about that?
Sure.
Because in Marx's 1844 manuscripts, he describes 5 different kinds of alienation based on capitalism. And one is, you don't own what you produce. You don't control the work process. The employer, the owner, the capitalist controls the work process. You're alienated from your fellow worker, or as he calls it, species being, through competition. You're also alienated from yourself, and you're alienated from nature.
Right. Thank you for that. That's a good, those are good points. And all of those obviously go together. You know, they're not the same thing, but as it happens under capitalism already in Marx's day, that whole package is happening. Whereas in some previous societies, you might have been alienated from some property or something without being alienated from yourself or from your family or something. Whereas in modern times, it sort of all comes into the picture. Other comments or questions?
There's another.
Bill
Oh,
Florin?
When he uses the word banalities, he doesn't really repeat it. he seems to be thinking of many different things, the technological advances, the slave relationship, even at that level. Can you say something about what he's thinking of?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing, I just think he means the ABCs. Obviously, he's using it in a humorous way. In fact, that title, "The Totality for Kids," is sort of another way of saying the same thing. And right at the very end, let me see where we'll skip ahead to near the end of part 2. He says, so many other banalities could be examined and reversed. The best things never come to an end. Before rereading this text, which even the most mediocre intelligence will be able to understand by the third attempt, blah, blah, blah. So look, he's using language like Lautréamont uses it. It's like a stab. It's like this is something that is intended to shake you up. And no bullshit, and so when he does something like that, of course, it does shake you up. You say, well, I've already read it 5 times and I only understand 1/10 of it. Or so I think that's the main thing that sticks with me with this. Judy?
On page 126, he says, born of man's will to survive the uncontrollable forces of nature, myth is a public welfare policy that has outlived its necessity. Well, he uses myth a lot, and I'm kind of confused about what he means.
Well, I think at some point he actually says specifically what he means, but I think we can take it as being that there is some story or image, picture of heroes, gods, great epic journeys, heavenly families, all these kind of things that are not only believed by people, but form a powerful notion of what reality is. I mean, to the point that they may think, oh, our everyday reality here is just practically nothing. That's what's really the stuff, And so then they can think, oh, it's much more important to build a big church than to feed somebody that's starving, because that's the gods, they rule, they do this. So you can have obviously myths that starting from that origin, we can say, well, there are modern myths. There's the myth of the Bolshevik Party heroically doing blah, 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 or there's the myth of, things that we might read in novels or, pick up from, some kind of thing. But the gist is that it's not exactly the same as religion. It sort of overlaps with religion, but it's something that's, by comparison with these myths, you can say the mythic order had a certain unity to it, a kind of organic unity, even though it was based on something that didn't exist. It meant that, people's lives kind of had a coherence. They worshiped these gods and they did these rituals and this kind of thing. And they did not have the sense of being ripped off. But as time develops, then you have kings and this kind of thing like this. And then the myths come in and religions and so on. and they come in to disguise that. Like those old myths were not necessarily disguising anything. They may have just been, that's the best story we could come up with. Whereas the later myths say, worship the Pharaoh. I have put my son, the Pharaoh, on the throne here, and, And, divine right of kings and things like this. So that's still myths, but it's a different kind of myth. And then when we get to modern society, he's frequently giving modern examples, like the myth might be something we'd see in Hollywood or something like this. And the idea is these modern myths have lost their credibility. They're kind of chintzy myths. A lot of people don't believe them, and if you do, you're pretty naive or something, and they don't really satisfy. I mean, the idea of devoting yourself to a film star like you would have devoted yourself to your favorite saint or something like that is ridiculous, and yet people do that. But he's saying, because things have come to such a degraded angle, the power, the ruling class needed that old thing, that mythic thing, because that really helped things. It's made them seem like they were part of this unitary order that was inevitable. And if that is exploded and people don't believe all those myths, it's kind of like a Hollywood star myth isn't going to protect you from being assassinated because, so I think that's enough of that. Ed Alvarez.
Actually, you answered my question, but actually, I was actually talking about alienating and the abstraction of alienation, and how we can see it in our modern, mobile economies, where the worker keeps getting further alienated from his labor through like devices, and how we keep externalizing technology in a way to further create a separation where the worker can't even identify with a corporation, belong to a group. It's a complete sense of loss of a sense of belonging. And I think that's one of these kind of modern tragedies that we have. And then we can fall into the myth of the freedom, which is like a huge driving force of our late stage capitalism, where we have to create this freedom of identity and freedom of of being in charge of ourselves, where like we have 10 different apps telling us to do, but we're the ones that are in command.
Thank you.
So
Anthony?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just very briefly on the sort of the myth question. I think Vaneigem uses myth and ideology almost interchangeably at times during Basic Banalities. Yeah, and one of his arguments in Basic Banalities is that with the rise to power of the bourgeoisie, you have the old sort of like religious myths and ideologies are sort of slayed, so to speak, but then you have myth ends up becoming in the back door, so to speak, or recomposed. And so Vaneigem wants to talk about the dominance of the commodity form and the commodity economy as essentially sort of the prime myth, right? Like at one point he talks about the spectacle as the modern myth, yeah? And there's even resonance of Marx as well. Marx talks about sort of like the myths of the capitalist class, justice, freedom, liberty, so on and so forth, right? So I think you really can't understand this idea of myth in Vaneigem without sort of like a reference to Marx's sort of concept of ideology, particularly the way that Marx sort of describes it in the German ideology. There's almost an exact one-to-one sometimes between Vaneigem's sort of account of the development of myth and alienation with Marx's sort of account of the development of private property in his early work.
We want to move on because we have the other half of this. So let's see here. So I'm going to be even more brief in reading some of these part two notions. But one of the things, I think this first thing I'm going to read is actually the single most important one. So I'm going to focus on
Ken,
that.
have you done,
It's 15, section 15.
Ken? Have you done whatever you need to do before moving on?
Yeah, thank you. At least assuming that I'm, yeah. So in section 15, at some point in there, he says the vital objectives of a struggle for the construction of everyday life are the key sensitive points of all hierarchical power. To build one is to destroy the other. Caught in the vortex of desacralization and resacralization, that's the thing about becoming holy, or we aim above all to abolish: 1, the organization of appearances as a spectacle in which everyone denies himself; 2, the separation on which private life is based, since it is there that the objective separation between owners and dispossessed is lived and reflected at every level; and 3, sacrifice. So those 3 bad things we want to get rid of. These 3 elements are obviously interdependent, just as are their opposites: participation, communication, and realization. Realization could be fulfillment, another word for that. So I mentioned that basic banalities was in a large degree a sort of earlier version of this book, which Vaneigem came out with a few years later, The Revolution of Everyday Life. It's published in 1967. And in that book, the book is organized in 2 parts. The first part is called Power's Perspective, or the perspective of power. Remember, power could be, hierarchy or whatever. And the second part is called The Reversal of Perspective. And reversing these power perspective are things like, these are some of the chapters in the power thing: humiliation, isolation, suffering, work, exchange and gift, technology and its mediated use, the reign of quantity, mediated abstraction, sacrifice, separation, organization of appearances, role, survival. Okay, so the reversal is taking that and turning it around. And so it includes, to some extent, opposites of those respective things that I just listed. But it's so like creativity, spontaneity, poetry, masters without slaves, the unitary triad, which we'll get to in a moment, a new innocence. So the unitary triad is this fulfillment, communication, participation. And that is a chapter 23 of the book. And I'm going to read you 2, like a little more than 1 page from this. First of all, this is the, in front of each chapter, he has a sort of little table of contents, a little summary of the chapter. And this is his summary of this chapter. The repressive unity of power under its 3 aspects, constraint, seduction, and mediation, is simply the form, inverted and perverted by the techniques of dissociation, of a tripartite unitary project. In its chaotic underground development, this new society, the new good thing that he's talking about, expresses itself practically as a transparency in human relationships, which promotes the real participation of everyone in the fulfillment of each. So he's taken those 3 things: fulfillment, transparency would be communication, and participation. And he will later in the thing I'm just, I'll get to in a minute, he's saying that these things go together and they have to go together. If they don't, if they're not all three connected, there's something wrong and you're going in the other direction. If you have participation and communication, but there's no fulfillment, it's bullshit. You're participating and communicating in something that could be hell. If you leave out the communication, it's all great. You got fulfillment and participation, but there's no communication, so nothing happens. You're just alone with that thing. So all those three things are these key things that have to go together. And then he goes on to say the project of self-fulfillment, here's how they all kind of work together, is born of the passion to create. At the moment when subjectivity wells up and aspires to reign universally, the project of communication is born of the passion of love. When individuals discover that the desire for amorous conquest in themselves is identical in others, the project of participation is born of the passion for play. When the group fosters the self-fulfillment of each individual, the isolation of these three passions perverts them. Dissociated from one another, the three projects are falsified. The will to self-fulfillment is transformed into the will to power. In thrall to status and role-playing, it presides over a world of constraint and illusion. The will to communication turns into objective mendacity, lying. Founded now on relationships between objects, it provides the semiologists with the signs which it is their job to disguise as human. The will to participation serves to organize the loneliness of everyone in the crowd, setting up the tyranny of illusory community. Once cut off from the others, each passion may be incorporated as an absolute into a metaphysical vision, thus rendering it inaccessible. Our philosophers have quite a sense of humor. First, they break the circuits, then they say the power has failed. So basically, he's saying they've separated these three things from one another, and then they say, oh, that's too bad. Communication is impossible. It's just the nature of things because we cut it off from participation. On this basis, they can claim with impunity that self-fulfillment is a chimera, an illusion. Transparent communication, it's a pipe dream. And the ideal of social harmony, that's mere whimsy. True enough, so long as separation is the order of the day, everyone confronts only the impossible. So the idea here then, so anyway, that's what Vaneigem is talking about very briefly in that one little paragraph that I read from Basic Banalities. Right there, it just slipped in, you'd almost not notice it. And then later he turns it into a whole book. Then he goes on, I'm not going to read so much here, about how roles, one of the negative things, where roles used to be in a mythological context, they were kind of cool. Your role is a knight to rescue somebody or something. And now our modern roles are just, what is this? He says you can be a citizen, parent, sexual partner, politician, specialist, professional, producer, consumer. Yet what boss doesn't feel himself bossed? The proverb applies to everyone. You may sometimes get a fuck, but you always get fucked. So then this, in response to Vaneigem's language, we don't claim to have a monopoly on intelligence, but only on its use. Our position is strategic. We are at the heart of every conflict. The qualitative is our striking force. People who half understand this journal ask us for an explanatory monograph, thanks to which they will be able to convince themselves that they are intelligent and cultured, that is to say, idiots. Someone who gets exasperated and chucks it in the gutter is making a more meaningful gesture. Sooner or later, it will have to be understood that the words and phrases we use are still lagging behind reality. The distortion and clumsiness in the way we express ourselves, which a man of taste called, not inaccurately, quote, a rather irritating kind of hermetic terrorism, unquote, comes from our central position, our position on the ill-defined and shifting frontier where language captured by power, that's conditioning, and free language, poetry, fight out their infinitely complex war. To those who follow behind us, we prefer those who reject us impatiently because our language is not yet authentic poetry, not yet the free construction of everyday life. Any radical opposition that fails or that is partially successful, which amounts to the same thing, gradually degenerates into reformist opposition. Fragmentary oppositions are like the teeth on cogwheels. They mesh with each other and make the machine go round. The machine of the spectacle, the machine of power. In a caricature of antagonisms, power urges everybody to be for or against Brigitte Bardot, the Nouveau Roman, the newest model of the Citroën, Italian cuisine, mescal, miniskirts, the UN, the classics, nationalization, thermonuclear war, and hitchhiking. Everyone is asked their opinion about every detail in order to prevent them from forming one about the totality. It's one of his most memorable paragraphs, and I and some of my friends used those on leaflets. The first Situationist leaflet I saw was in Berkeley, had this comic woman, and there's a bunch of gears like in a machine, and she's saying, like the Situationists say, fragmentary opposition is, and she's got a sledgehammer just about to hit the machine. So I thought, okay, these are definitely situations. I want to meet these people. What does this mean? And we met them, and my life was changed. Then there's kind of an interesting remark. He goes into a thing about the lumpen proletariat, which in Marx's day, they were really frowned on because they were the people who would break strikes, who would bully the workers or, beat people up, or, they're just sort of the riffraff, the scum who don't do anything, and they're ready to be used by the bosses, as long as he pays them. But Vaneigem is saying, okay, that's, it's kind of understandable why they were in pretty bad odor back in those times. But he's saying a century later, he's saying now that we no longer think so much of the dignity of work and all this kind of thing, we can look at the equivalent people nowadays to say, well, they're quite right. Not that they're totally right, but it's completely understandable that they look at the idea of getting a job and they say, are you kidding? Fuck that. And if somebody talked to them about the dignity of labor, they would say, fuck you, man. You are a moron, get out of here. So that kind of salt of the earth, the wretched of the earth type lumpen that there are billions of nowadays in countries all over the world. Vaneigem is saying, while we're looking at different class kind of things, let's look at these people and see that now, they have, we're not in the old mode where we're saying, hooray for the workers, they work for their living and blah, 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 and criticize the bosses merely because they're not doing as much work as the workers or something, like any honest man should do. That is old hat. It's not, anybody who believes that is not going to know what's going on, and certainly not going to do anything about changing it. So anyway, that's an interesting thesis where he talks about those, and that's what he's getting at. And then he says, so the very last thesis, which is fairly long, he's talking about the SI, and it's kind of, I'm not going to go into that in detail, but his gist is that the SI is a very unusual, untypical type of organization. And he's saying that there are two, when you're talking about revolution or social change, there are two points about revolution and power. And he takes the first one is the Bolshevik Central Committee, because the Bolsheviks in their era were considered, oh, these are the real revolutionaries, whereas so many of the others had rallied to their patriotism in World War I and so on. And boy, Lenin and these guys are really doing this stuff. But of course, as we know, or anybody who has looked into these things, they end up becoming a new bureaucracy. And the origin of it is in the Central Committee. There's the Bolshevik Party that supposedly represents the proletariat, and then there's the Central Committee that supposedly represents the party. So you don't have all those thousands of people. And then there's a little key of 5 or 10 people who are at the head of the Central Committee, etc. And it ends up, in almost invariably being a one-person dictatorship in all the countries where that model was taken up. So he's saying, obviously, we are totally deadly against that. Then the other kind of extreme is the intelligentsia kind of hierarchy. And he's saying, we're also against this. This is the kind of thing that Nietzsche more or less promoted, that they're superior people, and so they blah, blah, blah. And he's saying, obviously, we're against this too. But we're in a position, or a tiny little group here, where we're saying, well, how do we act? We don't want to imitate either of those models, and yet each of those models has some kernel of truth, you might say, like the Bolsheviks, you can coordinate things, right? The blah, blah, blah. So he's saying that our model, our guiding image, could be the Durruti column, moving from town to village, liquidating the bourgeois elements, and leaving the workers to see to their own self-organization. The Durruti column was during the Spanish Civil War. Buenaventura Durruti was this great anarchist guy who led the most militant column, of a few hundred people against the fascists. And the point there is when he would arrive at a village or a town or something like this, and some of the fascists are there, okay, they fight out, they drive Franco's forces off, they kill what fascists they can find that didn't get away, or anybody in town, that said this guy was helping the fascists or something. And then, so to speak, I don't know if this was like literally how they did it, but so to speak, they didn't say, okay, now here's your, they said, okay, population of this town, we've got rid of the fascists now. We've got rid of these people who have been weighing you down and so on. Now we're off to fight and other things. It's up to you. What do you want to do? It's your play. And so as a result, many of those places, they set up their own commune, or they came up with all sorts of different ideas. But the point was that they were, in other words, the Durruti column had taken an aggressive initiative. They weren't saying, "Oh, we don't want to interfere with anybody doing," when you got other people with machine guns mowing down people, you kill them. It's obvious. These are like fascists who are going to kill you in an instant, or if they don't torture you first. So they're in a war, they kill them. But then they didn't take the typical kind of coup sort of thing, say, okay, now we'll run things because we represent the people. They moved on to continue the battle, and they said, people, organize yourselves. We've made it possible for you to do so. You couldn't have done it on your own because the fascists, you didn't have the weapons and blah, blah, blah. So Vaneigem is saying this is a model. It's kind of like a thought experiment. Obviously, it's not a literal model. But the idea is that when you see these harsh criticisms that are in these articles, as well as, interventions where they disrupt something or something like this is kind of the notion that they have in mind. And it's the notion I had in mind, when I disrupted a Gary Snyder poetry reading, 50 plus years ago, which I tell about in my book. I had read this carefully, and I did sort of think, okay, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to do this thing, which will hopefully shake things up, and then I'm out of here. I'm not coming in to offer myself as an alternative speaker or something like that. So that's kind of what the Situationists are mainly up to when they do interventions, when they put out a poster or a leaflet or something like that. The idea is to undercut, pull the rug out from under false stuff, bullshit stuff, and then to a great extent hoping that that kind of creative negation will inspire others when they're without the person telling them what to do, to say, hey, what do we do now? Well, why don't we do that? Or look, those guys are doing this. Or and that's what happens in radical situations. It's what happened in 1968 to an extent. And it's what happened like in the Spanish Civil War to a huge extent, just suddenly these things snowballed. So I want to stress that, like when we see the Situationists being so-called arrogant, or so, in some cases like this, actually hyperbolic. I mean, we can't take literally everything Vaneigem says. Their point is they're using these things as hopefully a weapon to burst illusions. And that's all it is. And so I think I'll stop there, and we can have some other Q&A. Anything in the chat, Denny?
Comments.
Okay.
Anthony.
Yeah, Ken, look, just on that last point about sort of disruption, and the sort of like just sort of smashing in, so to speak, making the disruption and getting the hell out, right? Like I have this sense that sort of like in the wake of 1968 and to an extent this sort of generalization of this tactic, right? This idea of a disruptive sort of like action has become sort of common coin within mass culture. It's something that sort of made its way into sort of pop music and popular culture more generally. You could even sort of like see that punk tried to sort of like take these things on board as well, to an extent. So how do you see this? Like, how do you see this, the lead that the Situationists were trying to provide in this way as having a relevance today? Say, for instance.
Well, look, Anthony. if somebody does something and it's effective and other people start imitating it, that doesn't mean it failed. I mean, it depends on what the other.
I'm not I'm not saying it failed, Ken.
You
What I'm sort of like, sometimes
it's true that if you perhaps did the same thing 50 years later, it might not be as shocking, or it might be more shocking. It kind of depends on which things we're talking about. Of course, you're going to change things according to the context that you're in. I mean, the Situationists were working in their very narrow little cultural context in Paris and a few other cities in Europe, basically. And so what they did is not something you'd do if you were in a factory in Africa or something. You know, obviously you're going to be doing different things and have different concerns. But the point is that you could look at these things and say, what would be analogous to that? Like, look at what those people are doing, and let's see, does that have some kind of relevance for me? And, you know, if it does, then these things spread. And then people say, oh, this is banal, you know, this is, I mean, as I said about Debord in his films, that this is my introduction to the translations of these. So I say, as a result of this new development, you know, like the spectacle has become a common thing. Statements by Debord that used to be dismissed as extravagant or incomprehensible are now, with equal superficiality, dismissed as trite and obvious. So, I mean, you can't win, you know, if you go by that, you know, like if they're obscure, oh, these are too obscure. And then if they become clear, oh, these are obvious. You know, like basically what's happened is that things that seemed obscure at a certain point, thanks in part to the Situationists and thanks even more to the general progression of, you know, social struggles and stuff like that, are now old hat. It doesn't mean you stop doing it. It means like, oh, people, if people were striking right and left, you wouldn't say, oh, strikes are old hat. You know, that doesn't mean anything anymore. Hell, it doesn't. You know, keep that up and we'll have a new society in very short order. So some of these things, if they get repeated, all it means is that you've won or that you're making a dent. You know, people here, I'll go on. People who used to claim that the obscurity of situationist ideas proved their insignificance now claim that their notoriety demonstrates their obsolescence. You know, so once again, you know, are they supposed to disappear or are they supposed to be visible or what? But those who think that the situationists have become co-opted because a few fragments of their works have been displayed in museums, dissected in universities, or discussed in the media, probably haven't bothered to reread them lately. I mean, the fact that those things are happening is not a failure. It's basically a success. The failure would be if the situationists themselves were in those positions. They had taken a position in the cabinet of some government or they, you know, whatever. But the positions themselves, you know, the ideas have not changed. What's happened is that the system has reacted by giving in over here and so on, just like actually capitalism reacted to Marx, as is well known, you know, like over a 50 or 100-year period, you know, if capitalism had kept acting like it was in 1850, it probably would have been overthrown. It would have been too brittle. But because of Marx and Marx's influence, you had more subtle understanding about how the system worked. I mean, the capitalists didn't even know how it worked as well as Marx did. And so once you have that, of course, then you have people making adjustments like in the New Deal or, you know, and having unemployment compensation and, you know, different social stuff like that. That doesn't mean it's a failure, but if you look at that, you can say, okay, it's not a failure, but it's also not exactly a success because it wasn't enough. We just have unemployment compensation, but we haven't changed wage labor, blah, blah, blah. So you can point that out, but the things like a disruption, how else are you going to do anything? I mean, either you're going to communicate without disrupting or communicate with or by disrupting, and one way or the other. So the fact that some of these things have become old hat, like if you feel they're old hat, like if you're in a punk generation and you think, oh, this is just happening all the time, then come up with something else. The Situationists did the same thing. When they were in the 50s, they didn't just repeat what the Dadaists and Surrealists had done. That would have been, we wouldn't be talking about them now if they had. That would be completely boring, uninteresting, unoriginal, and nobody would have been impressed. So what they did is things the Surrealists never thought of doing, even though they sort of resemble some Surrealist things, and some of these interventions resemble a little bit the Dadaists, but it's not like they're copying the Dadaists. It's just that they're picking up on some points of Dadaism, while at the same time denouncing others. You know, so it's this same thing. Like, if I was going to disrupt something, I might do it a different way than they did. And I don't know, you know, there's different, but the principle is the same. You want to go out and do something or nothing's ever going to happen. Anyone else?
There's a question in the chat. Occupy Wall Street.
Yes. This question, I could talk about that a lot. I don't know. I was very involved in the Occupy movement, and I wrote several things about it, which maybe I'll put in the email tomorrow. And in fact, I wrote one article about the Situationists and the Occupy movement. Exactly. And there's also, I've been adding some videos on my site, and one of the sites is a talk about the Situationists and the Occupy movement that I did in Oakland. Mm. So the gist there is, I don't want to repeat myself. I think it was excellent. It's the only movement in my life where I really got a sense. It was not like May 68, but it's the closest thing that we've come to that, at least since the 60s. And during the first month of that was the happiest month of my life. Hmm. So, because it's like, man, this is what I've been working on for 50 years, and it actually came here. I can't believe it. Son of a bitch, this is great. And I was walking on clouds for about a month there, you know, like without illusions. You know, it's just that I was looking around and said, Jesus fucking Christ. You know, I saw Occupy Wall Street happen, and I thought, wow, that looks really interesting. It'd be really great if that spread to one or two other big cities like Chicago or LA or something. And 2 weeks later, it's in more than 100 cities. You know, so that's how May 68 developed. It's like, it looked to the outside observers, it looked like, hey, this came out of nowhere. What the hell what's going on here? But all that happened is that a few people did something that happened to click. A lot of times people do things, but it just doesn't quite gel for one reason or another, not their fault. In this case, it happened to click, and we had the internet and all this, so that immediately it was known. We weren't waiting to follow it on the TV news or something. And immediately people started imitating it. But since they were doing it in their own place, all those occupies were autonomous. Mm-hmm. And so they varied drastically in their quality and things that they did, which I thought was the healthiest thing about the whole movement. I thought, please don't stop being autonomous. So we got 1,000 autonomous things going on here. So anyway, I will send that out, but that's all I want to say about that for the moment. So we can get on to any other comments. Sid Sedler.
I just wanted to thank you for that your comments about the Occupy Wall Street. I was never in the Occupy. I didn't go to the Wall Street thing, but there was a thing like that in Oakland that I remember going to, and it was kind of like, I'm feeling it a little now, actually. I'm sort of getting a little shivers just remembering when I went downtown Oakland, stop work, go downtown Oakland, see what's going on. And I got the sense, I think it was spoken about in, maybe the Situationists talked about this. I got the sense of, I think what they called life, something different about life. It was like more of like what somebody called a festival.
Yeah.
It was more like, wow, like you almost don't recognize the drudgery of everyday life. Most of the time it's just like, oh, you're just doing it. It's the endless stream of particulars, as my friend Ken Collins used to talk about. And it was like, whoa, it's like energy and people doing this stuff and self-organizing, free libraries and free kitchens and so on and so on. It was hard, I met some guy who seemed sort of a little crazy, but I really enjoyed talking to him. It's like, wow, this is like amazing. And it's like, so I didn't really do anything much about that. I mean, there was some thoughts about going, there probably were councils, there were probably these meetings going on at various times. But anyway, I just wanted to thank you for.
Yeah. That was one of I remember one of my friends who was echoing exactly my feeling, like when we were right in the middle of this, and he was saying, it's just such a burden off our backs. And I thought, yes. It's just exactly like what you're saying. It was as if I had been walking around with a 100-pound pack on my back all my life. And then suddenly it dropped off and I said, wow, I wasn't aware of that. I mean, actually, of course, I was aware of it. That's why I've been doing the stuff I've been doing for 50 years. But to actually feel it, that's it's a different matter, like, hey, I can breathe.
Yeah,
of course I've been breathing before, but you get the idea, like suddenly there's fresh air, suddenly things are in color that have been in black and white.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine if you don't go through it. I had a little bit of a inoculation into that back in I think it was in 74 or something. It was after the 68 thing at Columbia. I was in New York at the time, and there was an occupation of these 3 apartment buildings that were owned by the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And they had torn 3 of the buildings down and were going to take the other 3 and, like the song says, make a parking lot out of it. And people who were homeless and didn't, disaffected people, Latin American people, mostly from the upper 80s of New York, Amsterdam Avenue area, they just had this, like, what do you call it? A demonstration, marching up, and they just took the buildings over, they occupied it. And my friends moved into the 2 apartments. We were involved in a little, project where we printed a thing called La Ocupación. But one of the last things I'd like to say about it, it was very interesting and like energetic, and these meetings, and they talked about the enemy without and the enemy within. and the big enemy was the big power, right? In this case, it was the church. But it turned out, and this was a huge learning experience for me, was that there's this enemy within. I think the Situationists talked about the unions, how the union bureaucracy tried to betray the wildcatters or the actual rank and file. And we found that there were people within the building, the occupation, who were, essentially trying to make sweetheart contracts with the church and become the new leaders, and eventually we were actually attacked for saying that. And we had to defend ourselves with pipe wrenches. We had to hightail it because, we felt our lives were in danger. And this to me made the thing, the story, which I don't really know is enough about, but about the sailors of Kronstadt, who I think the Situationists speak about.
Yeah.
It made it real, it made it so once you're actually in the situation, what can you do to make sure to defend yourself, of course, and defend the situation against the people who were gonna who want to destroy it, which essentially is elements of what I guess has become known as a spectacle. That's a little confusing to me, the whole thing, but this is wonderful. Thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, thank you, Sid. Any other comments or questions? Any?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm just thinking how fabulous the meetings that I've been having on Zoom are about reaching out to various components in a society. And right now, the big thing, like with is to get involved with the youth. What do the youth want? So the youth are actually making decisions that are not really related to any of this history. They are really looking at what do they need, what do they want, and how to implement it. So you're starting to organize pods of people all over the country that are doing outreach within their community, and that way changing the way we make decisions. Like the Progressive Democrats of America, it's 200 people on a Zoom, everyone talking, and people that are running for office are talking, but everybody brings their most professional point of view and shares it and says, this is what we want. How do we do it?
Thank you. No, actually, your last few words there are, that sort of comes up almost any time, but it comes up particularly in radical situations. Because in ordinary times, you might say, well, what do we want? Oh, I'm tired. I'm going to go watch TV or something, but when things have kind of opened up a bit, then you can say, hey, what do we want to do? And it starts becoming a little bit more realistic.
And exciting.
Exciting. We can take over this building if we want to.
Right.
Maybe it's not a good idea, but it becomes something to discuss. We can, change the policy of this, or, we can go over here in the group, or any number of things. And that's the kind of conversations that people had in May 68.
Yes.
And actually, when I came to Berkeley in 65, although this is on a lower level, the aftermath of the free speech movement was like that. I would just walk down the street and you'd see people having heated discussions on street corners, and they may or may not have even known each other. They had just started to talk, and somebody else came in and, no, I don't know, but why do we do and it was just a lively conversation, and then some people would leave and other people would come in. So that's what happened. Like, you can guarantee during the free speech movement, which was kind of like a little mini May 68 or something, you can bet that that was happening on every street corner around the campus or something. And that's why it was so exciting, you know, and during the free speech movement, some guy that was writing about it later, like a year later or something, said, this was a university that was criticized for dehumanizing students. So, you know, that it was kind of alienating in some regards. He said, yet after this few-month period was over, I knew, at least as a nodding acquaintance, more than 1,500 people.
Wow.
I mean, these were just, you know, in other words, fellow students. You just see them around, and you know, that he would just say, I know that guy's name, or I don't even know that guy's name, but I remember he was in that group where we were discussing something and he said that. And where you would have these people, yeah, you know, it's like suddenly your family goes from 10 people to 1,000 people, you know, in the space of, you know, a few weeks. So those are the kind of things that that's in Joy of Revolution. I talk about that's a radical situation. And
well, the youth have their whole life in front of them,
yeah.
And they see what we're doing that makes everything fall apart. And
absolutely. Yeah.
Climate change, the fossil fuel,
Yeah,
war.
Absolutely.
So they clearly, if they are empowered by a community that wants to hear from them, have power and can change things. It's happening.
Yeah, I hope it happens more. Okay, so it's 7 o'clock now. If we want to keep another few minutes, we can go. I mean, I do want to stress this text by Vaneigem is by far the hardest one. We are over a hump. We have 6 more meetings for this book before we get to Debord, and every one of them, I mean, they're not pushovers, but all of them will be much easier to understand. I mean, they're an article about the Vietnam War, or they're an article about language, or an article about, you know, any number of things, and about May 68, obviously, and things like that. And in most cases, you'll be able to see, oh, yeah, they're talking about that. In the Strasbourg scandal, you have an exciting story, like, how did this happen? You know, let's see what happened and how it eventually, and then to say nothing of May 68, how did that happen? So we'll have a whole meeting about that. And 99% of that you are going to understand. Yeah, I mean, there may be unfamiliar things there, but it's not going to be that there's a sentence you don't know what the meaning is, which is often the case here. So you're over the hump. And so our next meeting will be back to sort of regular Situationist articles instead of this one kind of one-off thing, which is actually even harder than Society of the Spectacle for the most part. So anyway, take courage. And I'm glad we got the responses that we did get, and that you hopefully have gone through this. And I think having done that, you know, you'll anyway. I think I've said enough. I'll be doing that. So thank you again for showing up here. Thanks to my co-hosts. And I'll see you in a couple weeks, or if you're in my lit group, I'll see you in 1 week. And looking forward to it.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks,
So,
Ken.
if there's anything that you want to copy from the chat, and by the way, I automatically get a copy of the chat because I'm recording this, and I'm now going to stop the recording, by the way. Let me see here. Pause, stop.